how do you receive that grace? You reach up and take hold of it. Because it's there for you all the time. It's just like the prodigal son. Remember that the father's forgiveness followed him the day he left, and followed him down the road as he went away from the father. In alienation, having betrayed the father's forgiveness followed him and beckoned to him. But he couldn't see the hand of grace beckoning to him until he turned around to face it. And he turned around to face it when he was in his most desperate condition and suddenly realized how great the Father's love really was and his mercy, and turned around and went back to the Father. But, I mean, the whole amazing thing about that whole story is the way that the Father's standing at the top of the road looking for him every single day, and already has a robe over his arm. He doesn't run into the house and grab a robe and a ring. He's carrying the robe and the ring. He had already forgiven the son long before he turned around and came back, but the son couldn't receive that forgiveness until he turned around and came back. And the grace of God is ever present, but we don't receive that grace except the grace of life itself, of course. And I dare say, you know, that the grace of God has maintained and preserved us in many times, even when we weren't aware of it and didn't particularly care to be aware of it. But the grace of God is always there. It's all, the uncreated energy of God is ever present. The whole universe is an act of grace. The earth is an act of grace. Life is an act of grace. Everything is an act of grace. And yet we can go through that whole life of grace in a universe that was created through grace and still be totally alienated from God the day we die, because we don't turn around and try to take hold of that grace. Now, okay, we're saved through faith by grace, and not of works lest any man should boast. But what is actually being meant here by works of the law, of course? But it's a work to open our heart. Well, how could you get around the fact that you actually have to cooperate with grace or do something?
To work out your salvation.
Well, okay, the only way you could get around that was to invent or borrow from the Gnostics, actually, the doctrine of predestination.
Yes.
So you don't have to do anything because you're predestined to heaven or hell. So it doesn't do you any good to do anything anyway. You just sort of float through life, and if you're predestined to be saved, you're going to be saved. You're predestined to hell, you're going to go to hell. So you just have to try to discern one or the other, so you'll know whether to eat, drink, and be merry and do all kind of horrid things now, because you're going to go to hell anyway.
But even then you can still eat, drink, and be merry because you're going to heaven anyway.
Yeah, because if you're predestined, you can do all kinds of, and people do horrible things. When people say that they're absolutely certain of their salvation, because they're predestined to it, they really do some very horrid things and really injure and hurt a lot of people. That self-righteous arrogance that comes with it gives a person a right to be prejudiced, to be filled with hatred, to express malice toward others, and all these other things which they do. And let's not forget that apartheid was a Dutch Reformed Church doctrine. It wasn't a political doctrine, it was a Dutch Reformed Church doctrine. Slavery was justified by some people's, good Christians' interpretation of Holy Scripture. The fact that blacks and whites should never marry, because it's proven right there in the Scripture, that where, I'm not too sure where, but you know, it's supposedly, somebody could prove it from Scripture. You can prove that up is down and left is right from the Scripture, if you want to. Consequently, we have to stop and think about the entire picture. The prodigal son did have to turn around and go back to the Father to receive his grace. He was saved by faith through grace, of course. He had faith and he came back to the Father. But if he had faith and stayed with the pig trough, he still wouldn't have received grace. He had to come back to the Father, and he was robed with a robe of grace, and a ring of mercy was put on his finger.
So,
and forgiveness.
Vladika, what is this turning back? What are the steps I can take as a, say if I were still a Protestant Christian or Pentecostal or Roman Catholic Christian, what are the steps I could take to return to my Father's house?
Well, these things aren't magical. And we have to, first of all, realize that we're in alienation. And the first 3 days of Holy Week, the bridegroom services, are about our alienation. And that the heavenly bridegroom has come down to restore us. And remember, the crown of thorns is Christ's wedding crown, with which he was crowned to the church. And to realize our alienation, just as the prodigal son did, and desire not to be alienated, to desire to return. That desire lurks in everyone's heart. There's a nostalgia for paradise. And we have even a portion of our brain. God didn't leave us empty. Our brain is structured so that we can control our emotions and passions and control our desire for gratification. Unless it's hindered by some psychiatric situation, we have to practice doing it, though, or we don't do it. And we have a conscience, and we have a portion of our brain that's dedicated to spiritual experience and spiritual life. That's only reasonable. If God created us, He certainly created us with those elements. And so there's a nostalgia for paradise in everyone's heart. And very often, the reason that people live a tragic life is because they're alienated and can't grasp the fact that they're in alienation. We can be alienated from God, alienated from others, and most tragic of all, perhaps, alienated from our own self, and never find the way back to heal that alienation.
What are the steps now? I want to give them a positive.
First of all, just realizing the alienation and desiring not to be alienated. That's the beginning. You turn. And then you try to discern and to discover, to find, to learn something. What's the path back? The path back was given in the time of the apostles, the ancient church, and of course it hasn't changed. Nothing is new under the sun. We just have more efficient ways of doing the same wicked deeds or doing the same good deeds, either one. We have more efficient ways of doing the things we do, but nothing has changed. And to realize that, forget the Old Testament law. Not going to save anybody. It can't save anybody. Can't, you know, it can, the Ten Commandments, lived because they're law, can make society a better place.
Tutorial type of
It can make a society a better place to live in if everybody follows the Ten Commandments, which of course they don't, but if everybody did. But it can't heal your soul if you fulfill them just to avoid punishment. Because you have to learn to fulfill the Ten Commandments, for example, out of love and not out of fear.
It's along that path
Grace
that
comes to meet us. Grace comes to meet us. Yes, the Father ran down the road to the Son. The grace comes to meet us as we head back from our alienation.
We cannot do it ourselves.
No, and the thing is that once we make that commitment to return from alienation, then grace comes rushing to meet us. And when our heart's pure and sincere, it leads us ultimately. And this is the thing about the cycle of divine services, because it encompasses the entire year. And it becomes a moral support for us in our own moral struggle.
And nothing is left out.
No.
Because you have people preaching on one thing all the time.
Yeah.
And this way we get all
This way we get a full cycle of it. And the thing is, some of the verses, think of the verses on, and when people don't, they just read in the scripture about the healing at the pool of Bethesda.
Oh, wow.
Yes, but on the Sunday of Bethesda, when we have that hymn in the Matins that says, "For Christ comes to the man by the pool of Bethesda." And think about it for a moment. Son, do you wish to be healed? Yea, Lord, I wish to be healed, but I have no man to put me into the water. How can you say that you have no man? Behold, the Son of God has become your man. Rise up and walk.
And that gives me the insight.
I mean, that's so powerful,
into
really.
That healing that took place.
And then to understand the fullness of who Christ is, when we have the Stavro Theotokion, the cross, Theotokos on the cross, on Fridays and things of the cross. How is it that thou who didst suspend the earth upon the waters are now thyself suspended on the tree? This is the one who created the earth and raised the dry land from the waters in the beginning, now suspended on the tree. Let's know who this is, who did this. And on the Sunday of the meeting of Christ in the temple, in the Matins, says, "Behold, the Ancient of Days is today held as a babe in the arms of the aged prophet."